Good evening, comrades. Welcome to the latest session of our Communist Culture Club. Today, we want to look at the question of communists and elections, and we're looking at it from two different angles, but they're related, of course. We have with us Kat Rylance and Chris Strafford from Manchester. Communist Futures, their organization is called, and they're going to stand in the next general elections. We want to talk with them about what kind of program we should stand on, and to be honest, what is the point of communist standing? We're not going to win, but there are certain lessons we can draw from it and certain things we can learn from standing in elections. And then we're going to take a look at the old classic, the Communist Manifesto. And we have with us Steve Freeman, who is going to give an introduction on that. And as always, comrades can ask questions, can make comments, and there's no question that's stupid. We want to have the widest possible discussion with comrades, so don't feel shy about asking questions and comments. Good. Okay, so we're starting with Kat, and then I think Kat's going to do the introduction, and then we'll bring in Chris for a sort of discussion, a loose discussion after that. So thanks for joining us, Kat.
Thank you very much. Just make my notes up. Yeah, thanks very much for inviting us to talk about this. There's two parts that I want to talk about, really. Or there's two questions that I suppose need dealing with. First of all, why communists stand in elections generally. So I suppose the general question of historically how it's been approached, what exactly we've tried to achieve from it, what exactly has been the kind of orientation towards elections. So I suppose that's one question. And as I kind of talk about it a little bit, I'll kind of establish that we approach it as a tactic. So the second question that poses us is why communists should stand in elections now. So in this period, what is it, I suppose, that presents the importance of standing in elections now? And obviously, as Tina mentioned, me and Chris are involved in a local project to stand a communist candidate in Manchester. So that obviously relates a lot to what we've been thinking about. Why is it a useful thing to do now? Why does it kind of present us with some opportunity by doing that? So I'll sort of weave in some points relating to the project that we're working on as well. Okay, then. So thinking about the question of why communists stand in elections generally, so there's a quote from Marx and Engels at the address of the Central Committee to the Communist League that says, even when there is no prospect of achieving their election, the workers must put up their own candidates to preserve their independence, to gauge their own strength, and to bring the revolutionary position and party standpoint to public attention. So if we think about why communists stand in election, we can break that down really to bring revolutionary politics to public attention. So what we mean by that is to bring them out into the open. As I kind of go into a bit when I'm talking about the situation that we're in right now, it's about trying to bring them out of the niche or the familiar spaces that they can often occupy in society, and to try to push them out into the public sphere, into society as a whole. So elections represent this opportunity because they represent the time when politics is most widely mobilised in society as a whole. They represent opportunities for political discussion and political engagement that aren't always readily available in day-to-day life. So again, I'll talk about a lot of the politics that we do in our day-to-day life, and often those things are more immediate and they don't represent the opportunity to engage in higher political discussions, higher political kind of advancement and engagement that is represented by these opportunities. Also, as the quote suggests, it's an opportunity to gauge our strength in society, the strength of our politics in society, by presenting them publicly as a kind of barometer of support for revolutionary politics that exist in society. Again, I'll go into that a little bit more later on. Sometimes because of the spaces that we occupy in society, because we do occupy a lot of the time quite niche and familiar spaces, we often might not have a clear idea of the support that exists or the kind of level of engagement that exists with revolutionary politics. So again, it represents some kind of opportunity there to measure the level of engagement in society as a whole. And also, as the quote suggests, it serves the importance of preserving our independence, preserving the independence of working class politics, a revolutionary perspective within that. So when political spaces, when politics, political opportunities or forums or platforms exist that do remain relevant to most people in society, when we let those take place without us, when we absent ourselves from them, what we do is we absent the independent voice of revolutionary working class politics. So it's inevitable in that case that even advanced layers of the working class will end up being drawn into one or other camp, joining with interests that are not our own. And again, I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. So that's why we stand in elections itself. That's why we engage with parliamentary elections. It's also important to think about what communists have been able to do within parliament itself historically. So historically, communist representatives in parliament have sought to use that platform and press afforded by this position to advance communist politics to the widest degree publicly. So making use of the platform given by parliament, the access to the media, all of the opportunities available there to advance communist politics out in the open, out there publicly. Also to expose and hold to account the government and politicians on all sides, and to ensure that wherever such a political space exists, the voice of the working class and communists are heard within this. So that fits in with that idea of preserving the independence of working class revolutionary politics through our presence there, rather than absenting ourselves from that space and allowing the political voice of the working class to get drawn in into and sucked up by one or other side of the ruling class. So, for example, if you think about the charade of the culture wars that goes on now, the way it's discussed in the media, in parliament, if a communist voice was present in that, it would look completely different. There would be an independent expression of working class politics within that, and we wouldn't be drawn into taking sides within one or other sides of the ruling class on these questions. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit before I start talking about the period that we're in. I'll talk a little bit about Lenin's writing in Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder. So it's mainly chapter 7 in this, why communists or should communists engage with bourgeois parliaments. Essentially lays the basis of a lot of the arguments that people put forward around this question. It outlines the purpose of and the argument for communists participating in parliament and parliamentary elections. A lot of what he's writing there is largely in response to German and Dutch left communists who argued that parliament had been overcome, so it was obsolete and there was no need to engage with it. Obviously, from their side, from the left communist side, they were influenced in many ways by the experience of the degeneration of the Second International, and it manifested as attempts to explain and understand the trajectory, the kind of deformation of revolutionary politics. And part of the explanation that they came to around that was participation in elections and parliaments created pressures of incorporation and reformism, allowing that to set in to revolutionary politics. So that's kind of the perspective they were coming from. And Lenin's responses are to contest this claim that Parliament is obsolete. So Lenin's main arguments there definitely remain relevant to us, because obviously there is a tendency still within the left to see it as a waste of time, a distraction, something that when we participate in it, maybe we legitimize it. And it takes away from where real politics are happening. So there's obviously that tendency still exists to see it as obsolete, see it as something that doesn't need our attention and our engagement with. So those arguments still kind of remain relevant in our current period. So the central argument that Lenin puts forward in that chapter is that Parliament might be obsolete on the scale of world history, in the sense that it's a thing that must be overcome along with all other bourgeois institutions to bring communism into being. but it's not obsolete practically in the present struggle. So what he says is that until Parliament is superseded by forms of working class power, like Soviets, that reimagine decision-making and political representation, then it remains relevant to us. It is not obsolete. It remains a site that we must present ourselves in, that we must contest our politics within, even if part of that engagement is precisely to expose Parliament, to expose the kind of domination of the ruling class within these institutions. It's not a contradiction to engage in it and expose it. So, as I said, often objections are that we legitimise these institutions by participating in it. But in reality, it's often our absence from these spaces that does so instead, because it leaves that site empty, uncontested. We don't delegitimate it by not being there. It simply just takes place without us. And it loses the independence of working class politics, and we become drawn into other camps and other interests as a result. Obviously, it's not ideal to us that this is the form in which politics and political representation often take place, but until other forms emerge, then it remains important. It remains something that we need to engage with and pay attention to. So just because we believe it must be overcome, because we believe it doesn't reflect the true democratic exercise of power, it doesn't mean that we don't fight on that terrain. While it remains politically relevant to millions of people, including the mass of the working class and its advanced layers, then we should still make our case within it on every platform and medium that is before us to advance those politics. Okay, another key argument in the chapter is that participation in parliamentary elections is a tactic. So it's not the only expression of revolutionary politics. It's not an essential, it's not a principle, it's a tactic, something that is useful based on an assessment of the circumstances. And likewise, a boycott of parliamentary elections is also a tactic. And if you kind of think about the situation and the development of politics within Russia at the time, you can see that boycott of elections, counterintuitively, it's actually a boycott which often requires a greater degree of strength and consciousness within the movement to determine it as the correct tactic in the circumstances. So, for example, in Russia, after the 1905 revolution, it was the strength and consciousness of the movement itself that rejected the legitimacy of the newly created representative assembly. So in those circumstances, that made boycott a tactic that emerged from and reflected this strength and consciousness within the movement. When we think about boycott in a time of retreat or in lower levels of strength, it doesn't achieve the same political clarification or advance. So a quote from the chapter, which I think is quite important, is that you must soberly follow the actual state of class consciousness and preparedness of the whole class. As long as you are unable to disperse the bourgeois parliament and every other type of reactionary institution, you must work inside them. So avoiding or boycotting elections from this perspective can look less like a tactic when we're in a period such as we are now. It can look less like a tactic and more like a way to avoid confronting directly the isolation of our politics and organisation in society as a whole. So when we think about, for example, on the left, we might be able to rally big numbers at protests and actions, or our organisations might experience some growth. In those circumstances, it can be easy to insulate ourselves from the wider position of isolation that we're in. So, for example, the membership numbers of the Bolsheviks are often mobilised as a rallying point in this respect. We might look at the small proportion of the working class they represented in membership in the years running up to 1917, and then see how rapidly they were able to grow and propel forward in the immediate revolutionary situation. We might look at ourselves in the same circumstances. Perhaps it would be the same for us. Our numbers might be able to grow and kind of swell at that same rapid pace. But this sidesteps the development and consciousness of the workers' movement itself and its relation to revolutionary ideas. So if we look at the Bolsheviks throughout that period, they stood in elections and they got elected. They had deputies to the Duma, to the representative assembly. But if we stood now, if any of these small groups on the left stood, our fate would not look the same. This is not to put down the correct optimism that people might have in this period. I do think that optimism is essential to have, and I do think there's many reasons to believe it's correct as well. But it is to confront soberly and honestly the tasks that we have in front of us. And the reality is that if we stand in elections, we know that we would struggle to make any impression at all in those elections. As I said at the start, elections serve as that barometer, as that measure or impression of the position and engagement with revolutionary politics in society as a whole. We might not like what we're confronted with when we stand in elections, but we should soberly take this head on, not retreating into our spaces or positions of comfort, but pressing onwards with the task of patiently building our politics out in the open in front of society as a whole. I'm just going to go on now to think about why communists should stand in elections now. Can I get an idea of how much time I've got left, Tina? Sorry.
About 10 minutes if you want. You can have even more if you like. I'm enjoying it.
Great, thank you. Okay, so the other half of it is why should communists stand in elections now? So significantly, what I will talk about here specifically is why communists should stand in elections now as communists, because this is what I think is fundamental here. Obviously, there are plenty of communists who will stand as something else for various reasons on social democratic politics. And there's obviously important discussions that need to be had around that, which hopefully will come out a little bit maybe in the second half when we think about programme and come out maybe in contributions as well. But the focus, I think, is important, is on the question of communists standing in elections openly as communists, openly presenting and seeking to advance communist politics in the public sphere. A lot of this, and this is kind of similar things to what we've discussed and said locally in the project that we've been working on, a lot of this involves some significant criticism of what we've all been doing or haven't been doing as communists. I hope this isn't received badly by anyone, because it is definitely self-criticism as much as anything. So the reality is that as communists in this period, we are isolated in society. Our politics, our ideas, our organisations do not have a significant and open presence in general society. Placing emphasis on the tactic of standing in elections is about trying to confront this situation in an honest way, to think seriously about how we can break out of this isolation and to try and take some steps, however small, towards doing so. So this is a question of politics and of organising. As communists, many of us are engaged in organising actively within the public sphere in our unions, community organisations and groups. And this stuff is absolutely essential, but very rarely are we engaged in organising actively within the public sphere openly as communists, seeking to advance communist politics. And where we are represented in the public sphere, it's often in name or image only. It might be the label communist or the imagery of the hammer and sickle, but the political content itself very often becomes focused on reforms to the system, reflecting the politics of social democracy. Transformative, radical, revolutionary politics, our politics, are very rarely expressed in a serious, open and confident way in the public space. We might discuss them amongst ourselves in reading groups, in the pub, things like that, but very rarely do these ideas spill out openly into general society. As communists, it's our responsibility to push beyond this situation, to organise in a way which raises the questions of politics, power and political organisation in a serious way, and to bring our politics, radical communist politics, out into the public space to, as Marx and Engels describe in the Communist Manifesto, which might be touched on in the second half, to openly declare our views and aims before society as a whole. This requires a confidence in our ideas and in ourselves as well. The activities that this might involve, things like door knocking, speaking our ideas in the open, doing speeches in towns, debating and discussing in communities, presenting ourselves publicly and without shame. These require a confidence that most of us won't have right now. I certainly don't, but obviously it's something that is fundamental to take on, and it's something that we've been trying to kind of think about a lot locally as well. But as we say, this is a confidence that is needed, and it will only come through practice, through the practice of doing the things that require it, of trying to break out of that isolation. To a degree, a lot of these things, a lot of these practices that might have been quite usual amongst communists when we were in a position of greater strength, they've become things that we're unaccustomed to. Perhaps sometimes we become even comfortable in our niche in society. We have our customs, familiar ways, and our practice in our small little corner of society. But ultimately, we need to leave that comfort behind. We need to reclaim, in all seriousness and confidence, the vision that our politics are the politics of power, that they can become dominant across society as a whole. This is also a cultural question then. It's about the way that we see it and present ourselves. So obviously it fits kind of loosely within the general theme of the series in that respect, because it's about shifting the way we see ourselves and our politics within society as a whole, and challenging the comfort that we have in these small spaces and practices that we occupy. And this is something that has been really important to us in our project in Manchester, something that we've been trying to think through a lot and think carefully about how we can challenge those aspects that we've become comfortable with in the spaces and practices of the left as a whole. So this specific tactic of standing a communist candidate in elections is important in this period then, because it raises clearly the question of politics and political organising in a way that is not always openly posed through our union and our community activity. It presents the opportunity to advance this communist voice, communist politics out in the open and with the widest possible audience. The aim of this is to take advantage of the time in which politics and political questions are most present in society as a whole, however limited the scope of this might be initially. It represents the opportunity to intervene in this space that is opened, to ensure our voice is present, and to take advantage of whatever platforms and tools are presented by it. I'll just go through, just because obviously we've been having a lot of discussions locally around this, so people have raised different kind of thoughts and criticisms. So I'll just kind of engage with some of those a little bit, and maybe they can be picked up more in the discussion itself. So the first concern that I think is significant that people tend to have around this tactic or this approach is that by engaging in this tactic, we might make it appear that our aims as communists can be achieved through parliamentary democracy or reform to the system, that socialism is something that can be delivered from above, that political action and transformative change can almost be passively achieved, that you can simply mark an X on a ballot paper, vote for us, and we will do this for you on your behalf. Absolutely, that can't be the case, and we need to keep that concern at the front of our minds and be clear throughout whenever we engage in it that this is a tactic and that the motor of transformative change remains class struggle, which requires the widest possible organisation and action in every sphere, which requires the independent self-organisation of the working class. Socialism is not as something that can be done for the working class, but by the working class. So this tactic is useful in the space and the platform it provides to us to advance these ideas and to engage in ruthless criticism of a political system that would itself encourage this passivity and constrain our horizons. But at the front of this throughout needs to consistently be a vision of socialism from below that seeks to link the day-to-day experiences and issues people face to questions of our wider strategy and political perspective as communists. A further concern, not necessarily unrelated, it's often kind of, especially in conversations that we've had with comrades locally about engaging in this project, a further concern is that it becomes a misdirection, that it might be seen as a waste of energy that we could instead be putting into community organising or our union work. As I said earlier, I think these things are absolutely essential. They're the spheres in which class struggle largely takes place in this period. And certainly the traction of any communist politics will always be dependent on what is happening in these spheres and our work within these spheres. Those ideas can't be advanced in the abstract. They need to have that relation to those sites of class struggle. But our position as communists involves a commitment to a wider political strategy, the complete transformation of society as a whole, and a belief that these struggles that we're involved in, these different struggles within our unions, community groups, that they all, that we should raise that strategy within them, that they should all be directed in some way towards that aim. It's our responsibility then to raise that aim openly before society as a whole and to make some political advance on our situation, raising the question of politics, power and political organisation in a way that we very rarely have the opportunity to do when we're involved in community organising and union work alone. So it's about trying to make the connections between these spheres. Election work is just one thread of a wider approach that we need to develop in order to become a powerful social and political force, just as participating in and supporting strikes or campaigning against police violence and organising within our communities might be. What election work such as this brings as its strength in conjunction with these other tactics is that it brings a clear and explicit political voice to our work in this age, as we said, where these opportunities for open and strident argument for communist ideas, when they're very often rare and we don't often see that openly presented. Okay, so those are the main things that I wanted to say around the approach generally. I'll also just say a little bit about our project in Manchester. We're still in the process of developing this, and it's really at the moment quite a small scale project locally. We aim to kind of set this project up to try and pull together and work with other communists in the area, with that kind of emphasis on making an open, clear and public communist intervention in the election. One thing that was important to us in our approach and the kind of the thinking behind it is the idea that common work can be a site in which we can progress forward. Obviously, one of the kind of elephants in the room or the questions raised around this, again through discussion with others, is that standing in elections now when we don't have anything that kind of really resembles a communist party on the left, that it's preemptive, hasty, putting the cart before the horse. These are the kind of discussions we've had around it. And absolutely, in terms of what we would kind of look towards, that party is the organisation that we would look towards, and that is the essential task of this period. We wouldn't see what we're doing as separate from that. We tried to emphasise through this that it is through common work that we're often given that opportunity to thrash out our politics, to kind of explore and consider our differences, to debate these, to work through these, through that basis of kind of comradely trust that we gain through engaging in common work together. And that's certainly a positive aspect that I've kind of experienced through working on this project so far. So I certainly wouldn't see it as something that is kind of separate from the essential task that faces in this period. It's trying to make some contribution in some way towards that. So I won't say much more on the project. It's kind of still in the works, really. We're standing in the local elections as a kind of dry run, but we're going to try and aim mainly towards the general election. But yeah, we're kind of making progress with it, working on our manifesto, and definitely look forward to sharing and discussing that with people when we're at the point of putting it out. Yeah, I'll leave it at that, but I'm interested to hear the discussions and further ideas around it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kat. That was very interesting, and I'm glad to hear that there are communists standing elsewhere. I am fully in support. It'd be interesting to hear from comrades who don't think it's a good idea. So if you would like to make a contribution or ask a question, please click raise hand and I can bring you in. And I've also brought in now Chris, because I've got a couple of things we could discuss now to get the ball rolling. I mean, for a start, the question of the Labour Party is still quite interesting, of course. Labour will win almost by default unless something huge happens. I mean, the Tories lose, basically, and Labour's left. and will win. It's not a Tony Blair type landslide. It will probably be a landslide, but there's no positive feeling around it. So that actually is a good position, isn't it, for left-wingers to stand in that kind of situation, because you're not going to get charged with splitting the vote or whatever, letting the Tories in, etc., because it looks like very likely there will be a Labour victory, and it's such a bad Labour Party that there really is no reason why we shouldn't oppose standing there. I mean, how do you see the relationship with the Labour Party? Would you say that, I mean, you know, I quite agree that it is an entirely tactical question. So there might be areas where there's a good Labour lefty standing, then communists could probably support that candidate. Are you choosing a seat where there's a right winger standing, or how are you choosing where you're standing? Don't know if Chris wants to answer that.
Yeah, so yeah, we chose Manchester Central for a number of reasons, but one of the reasons is that it is Lucy Powell's seat, and Lucy Powell is currently the shadow education minister, and most likely going to be education minister or a minister in the next Labour government. It's not the main concern that we had, but we thought that we would that helped us pick where we were going to stand. I mean, in terms of Labour, I mean, I suspect comrades may share our view that it is not a site of struggle at the moment. The class struggle is not being played out within the Labour Party. We can all see why, and we've all seen what happened to Corbynism and those years. So I think you've got, as you said, Tina, an interesting space where you've got plenty of independents that are popping up that are challenging and winning in seats that Labour would have expected to win. On a small scale in local elections and what have you, in Galloway in a big way in Rochdale. I'm not a fan of Galloway by any stretch, but his win in Rochdale, you know, was a real boon for the Palestine movement, a real boon for all of those that are, you know, opposed to the growing war and what have you. So I think when it comes to where communists and the left in general stand in the Labour Party, I think you vote communist where you can. If you can't vote communist, then there's Tusk or Independent Socialists or the Workers' Party. You vote for them. You know, you may vote for someone like Diane Abbott, but beyond that, I mean, I can't see who else you would vote for in the Labour Party at this point. You know, when they walk through the lobby in Parliament against a ceasefire vote, you know, on multiple occasions, only to change their mind when the Americans change their mind and when their poll numbers take a little dip. I think you know, I would encourage all communist organisations to think seriously about standing in the general election, and that would be yeah.
I mean, one problem, of course, we're having as the left is that there are almost as many campaigns as there are lefties around. You've got Tusk. I mean, to be fair to them, I have lots of differences with them. They've really tried hard to bring the left together, but, you know, the Workers' Party is doing their own thing. Transform's probably doing their own thing. There's probably other local communists standing who are doing their own thing. Communist Party of Britain, perhaps, Morning Star. I mean, why aren't you getting involved with that? I mean, it's good you're doing it, but it is a weakness, surely, that you're only local and not a national campaign. Or do you see it as a strength? I don't know.
A bit of both, I guess. You know, the Communist Party is standing in Salford, so that's the Morning Star's Communist Party standing in Salford. Tusk is standing in a ward as well. The Workers' Party is standing in a couple of wards. But in terms of communist challenge, with the local election on the 2nd of May, it is Communist Future who has the most candidates in Manchester, which we were very shocked by. We have reached out to other comrades in Manchester, both at the beginning of the project and throughout, and spoken to them and what have you. But it is an absolute mess, I think, and you can see this with this no ceasefire, no vote stuff, and you can see this with the Workers' Party and with Tusk. There's an absolute clamour to get your candidates named quicker than George Galloway can name his candidates. I think that, politics aside, I mean, that looks like a mess. So when you go to when the working class goes to the ballot box and they see Tusk, they see Workers' Party, Socialist Alternative, or see us or what have you, Morning Stars, Communist Party, I think, what the hell is going on here? And to be fair to Tusk, I mean, they have wrote to many organisations and said, let's do it all together and whatnot. And in terms of the politics that these comrades are standing on, I mean, they're barely indistinguishable. I mean, I was looking at the manifesto that Ben Uggetti is standing on in Sheffield, and it's against cuts, against war, reopening a post office, all very noble, supportable things. And then you look at a Tusk candidate, it's a similar thing, against war, against cuts, and what have you. What is their real differences there? What is why aren't they standing as a single national body? Why don't we have common organisation if that's the level of politics?
Yeah.
For us, we wanted to take a different approach and not go for the lowest common denominator that we could find and find as many people as possible wanted to do that. But we went for, let's bring communists together and go and make the argument for communism in public, and go from there. And it is a weakness. I think you're right, Tina, that it is a weakness. It is only a local project. Ideally, we would love to see a national project. Ideally, we'd love to see a national communist party. But we are a few steps away from that. And Kat put it rightly. We're not putting the cart before the horse or anything like that, because at the moment, and it's where we are. There is no cart and there is no horse. So we have to start from somewhere.
Yeah, I agree. So let's talk about then why we stand, and Kat touched on a few things, but there's an issue about standing in elections in order to, I mean, you look at Tusk standing and you get the idea they think they can actually run capitalism, they can actually take over parliament or something ridiculous. And you kind of think, well, what kind of job would they be doing? And we've got enough examples of what happens when socialists try to go the reformist way and try to get into parliament. We make things a bit better. I don't know, it's better to be in there and just make it a little bit better for the working class. And of course, what happens with the Linke in Germany, with Refundation in Italy, Syriza in Greece, the list is very, very long, is that you end up sort of managing capitalism on behalf of, capital, not on behalf of the working class. And that puts us puts communists, and these are often Marxists, self-declared Marxists, in a really terrible position. And of course, they don't get elected again; they get booted out as soon as the next election comes along. So, I mean, how do communists protect themselves from that kind of trajectory of we can do it better? We just do trying to do it a bit better for the working class.
I mean, obviously, I suppose we would all roughly share the same perspective on this, which, obviously to a degree is kind of been something we've tried to reflect in the development of our project and the manifesto we've been working on. But it's the importance of having a clear program that expresses, first of all, why we present demands on the system as it is, why we present existing demands, but also how those link to the project itself of the transformation of society. So the importance of program, but also the importance of democratic organization of a party itself, which again, as we said, that is a weakness in what we're doing. We're not a party, we're a kind of a local project, and we wouldn't, obviously we're very far from being remotely in the position where anybody would get elected. I think nobody's getting elected as a communist until we have a communist party, is the truth of that. But yeah, if you think about, I suppose, the way that Bolshevik deputies behaved in the Duma, they didn't have this kind of personal freedom to go in there and say whatever they wanted to do and behave as they wanted to do. They were held to account by the party itself. Speeches were written for those deputies. So I think there's a kind of account of one of the deputies was a police spy and found that he had very little freedom to even do what he wanted to, to even subvert the Bolshevik Party within that position, because he was so tightly held to account by the party itself. So, you know, kind of the importance of program, the importance of a clear perspective on why we engage in these tactics and why we present demands in the immediate, how those connect and link to demands for the transformation of society, but also having a very clear hold upon anybody who becomes a political representative, and the party itself serving as the tool to keep a hold upon those people. Obviously, that's kind of very far away from where we are as a local project, but I also think that the dangers for us are not so great, because we're not particularly in danger of getting anyone elected immediately.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, the question is coming up in Ireland, for example, you know, where there's talk about a left government of sorts with, you know, Sinn Féin, and where the local people before profit, you know, the Socialist Workers' Party in Ireland, they're talking about, you know, helping to form a left government, etc., which I think there's a lot of problems with that in terms of sowing illusions in the working class that, you know, you can, in this period of capitalism and utter crisis, that, you know, communist socialists in parliament or in government actually could make a huge difference. So managing capitalism is a problem. Being in parliament, however, you know, George Galloway in parliament, and I agree with Chris, I have more criticisms than I have, you know, fingers on my hands of the man with his socially really conservative social policies. But, you know, he will and has already spoken up against the war in Gaza and the genocidal policies of Israel. So that's a huge you know, possibility for the left, and that's a huge victory from that perspective. You know, that somebody can speak up for Palestine. Claire Daly and Mick Wallace, MEPs from Ireland. I mean, they are brilliant. I'm not sure they consider themselves as communists anymore. I think they come from that tradition, but they're certainly socialists. And, you know, the funny videos where, you know, you can see people sleeping in parliament while they're talking. Doesn't matter. They're talking, their clips go online and millions of people watch it. That's a brilliant, brilliant way to use parliament as a platform. And that would be, I think, what communists aim for, isn't it? Using parliament as a platform rather than as an attempt to try and tweak capitalism and hope that we can have a sort of parliamentary road to socialism, because I don't think either of you believe in that, do you? No. We've got a couple of people now with their hands up. Malcolm, would you like to ask a question or make a contribution? And also William, if you both could switch on your cameras and then come in. Who's first? Malcolm, hi.
Yeah, Steve, who's here, has heard me ask this question on Monday, but it's a question that always puzzles me when I hear people talking about left-wing politics, and I keep hearing the class struggle and the working class and so on. And I'm often puzzled by what anybody means by that anymore. I mean, I think I'm English, so I don't live in England, but I think when I was growing up, which was in the 50s, there was such a thing as a working class, because as I'm sure you all know, the working class came from the countryside, was pushed into these terrible towns and terrible employment. And there's a book written, I think it was by Stefan Zweig, is his name, who went in the
Stefan Zweig,
in the 40s, and he went and talked to people who were in the working class, because people who, the middle class, if you want to call them that, had no idea what they did. And if you read the book by Stefan Zweig, the people in the working class, which was then sort of fairly well defined, had almost identical lives. I mean, there was some variation about whether they gave all their wages to their wife, or they gave half, or whether the wife kept the thing and gave it back to them. And they almost all did the pools, and they all either went to football or the greyhound, and they went to the pub, and there was sort of division of labour within the working class. So the working class could be quite clearly identified. And of course, there's also the question of how you speak. I mean, you know, that was, but nowadays, I wouldn't have thought, where I don't live, that you could identify people clearly as working class. So as I was saying to Steve the other day, as far as I'm concerned, I'm working class, because you won't think so from the way I speak, but but all my life I've lived on what I earned. So, I mean, you know, that's what I did. I would have thought that would be somebody who was a worker. I mean, I've never had means of production particularly, and I've never had sort of property I could rent or anything like that. So I just earned salaries, which were not wages, but salaries. I wasn't unionized, which is probably a weakness for me. And that's how I lived my life. Now I'm retired, but I when people talk about the class struggle and the ruling class and the working class, I mean, I'm always interested to know actually what they mean in detail. Thank you.
Thanks, Malcolm. Would either of you like to reply?
I mean, I would agree with the broad definition that you put there in terms of the working class being those who depend on the wage and have no other option but to work for a living. But at the same time, I don't think that when we talk about the class struggle, it's necessarily having the focus is necessarily on static definitions of class as a kind of emphasis, assigning this person working class and that person working class. It's about seeing the working class in the dynamic sense. So understanding or approaching it as a political question as well, the question, I suppose, of class composition, and that when the working class has been at its strongest, the working class has always been a very kind of diverse and non-homogeneous force. People have worked in different sectors of work, had different working patterns. We've had immigrant labour, we've had internal immigration from one area to another. It's always been made up of different sectors and different components. But in the political sense, it's about the working class becoming a class for itself through political organisation. And when it's been at its strongest, it's because it's tied in that sense to the question of political organisation. So certainly when we talk about it now, it is very kind of like abstract, and it feels very abstract because we don't have independent kind of political representation of the working class or strong independent working class spaces or politics. And it's almost, I suppose, the way that I guess I would look at it. I'd be interested to hear what other people kind of think on the question, but it's something that it's the purpose of the party itself. One of the purposes is to cohere those forces together and to always kind of advance the shared interests that the working class as a whole, in all of its kind of messy sort of diversity, has together. That's sort of a political question that confronts the party that doesn't exist, but that would be a task that would stand in front of it, I would think.
Sorry, could I just say one more thing? I'm sorry. Because the reason I mean, I was a professional, I suppose you call I was professional, and I suppose most of the people I worked with weren't sort of socialists. Some were, but most weren't. And I don't think they thought of themselves as working class. And if you're appealing to the working class, I mean, I don't know what the percentage of, say, the British population actually lives on what they earn. I mean, I'm sure it's quite a high percentage. And I think a lot of people who don't regard themselves as the working class should, because I think socialism would benefit much more people than they actually realize. They think somehow they're above it and they're going to move up and somehow something great's going to happen and they're going to, you know, drive around in big cars and all that nonsense. And so I often wonder whether approaching politics for a whole population and talking about the working class doesn't in fact alienate quite a large percentage of the population that should actually be agreeing with you. Sorry, that's all I'm going to say. I'll be quiet.
Thank you, Malcolm. I mean, we should say that the working class is now globally for the last few years, it's globally now the vast majority. It's become, you know, peasantry, so small peasantry, etc., has been pushed into the proletariat, etc. But yes, for sure, class consciousness is not as developed as we would hope. But yeah, standing in election can be one way of achieving that. I mean, you know, it's almost that you have to explain to comrades, to people that, you know, what it means to be working class. But it is actually, you see studies, you see polls, and you often get a vast number of people quite aware that they are working class and don't see it as a bad thing. Yeah, there are people who think they're middle class or something, but I think there's a quite a large section of people who do consider themselves as working class. We're trying to get to the next item at about 8 o'clock, so I'd ask comrades to be a bit short now with their questions, etc. So, William, please.
Well, just talking about Ireland there, and I think is around a lot of misconceptions. If you think there's going to be a left-wing alliance between Sinn Féin and People Before Profit, you're wasting your time. It's not. Mary Lou comes from a Fianna Fáil background, and she's after moving Sinn Féin towards Fianna Fáil. And Fianna Fáil are a middle-of-the-road Liberal Party. Now, as for Clare Daly and Mick Wallace, first of all, Mick Wallace was never involved in any politics. He was a major builder in Ireland. And when the international economy collapsed in 2008, he went belly up. And then he stood for elections, and he got elected in a protest vote. And he says the right things and all of that. Now, as for Clare Daly was in the Socialist Party, which I don't think was militant. Well, if it was before she joined it. Now, I work with independent socialists. There's 4 or 5 of them in the Dáil, and the one nearest to me would be Thomas Pringle. I live here in Donegal, and he's our TD in Donegal. Now, we had a meeting before the last European elections, which was 4 years ago, and I spoke against Clare Daly and Mick Wallace standing for elections, because what they were doing was they were breaking up the Dáil team, and there was a good Dáil team there that was ready to build, and they were the main opposition. They were bringing all kinds of things out that other parties weren't bringing out, and then they stood and they went into the European Parliament, which is not only a talking shop. They get very little publicity in Ireland for what they do in the European Parliament, but they do get a lot of international, and even they get more coverage in the British papers for what they're doing in the European Parliament than they do in the Irish papers. It was the way the establishment had of getting them offside, and they're wasting their time there. They're after breaking our radical group that we had going, and I think that's a shame. Now, as for the British working class, somebody that was brought up in England, I don't really have a lot of faith in this. Sorry about that. You don't have a radical tradition. We have a radical tradition in Ireland on the national question. And you don't. You just have an imperialist. The British working class are complicit with the empire. And that showed itself in the last general election when Corbyn got absolutely hammered. You don't have a radical history. I'm sorry about that, but you're fooling yourselves if you think you do. Now, I think there's more hope for Ireland than there is for Britain. So I can't see any communists getting elected in Britain at all. For many years, the biggest communist support he's ever got was immediately after World War II, when I think there was 4 communists elected, or 3 anyway, in that first election. Also, the Labour Party walked in. So after that, then everything just slid down.
Thanks, William. There's a cheery talk. But
that's the way I see it.
I suggest I'm going to bring in the other 2 people with their hands up, and then you both can reply to them. Okay, Victor first, and then Alan. Hello, Victor? Victor, I don't think your microphone is working. Alan, bring you in.
Hi there,
Hi.
Alan Story here from Woodbridge in Suffolk. I used to live in the same town as Tina. Hi, Tina.
Hello.
Three quick points. One, I have a little Substack now called The Left Lane, and I spent 8 hours interviewing former members of George Galway's Workers' Party. It is a complete shit show. It is so undemocratic. He makes policy on his YouTube channel. It's a terrible party. And I wrote 6,000 words on an expose of what Galloway is all about in this party. I do not think that George Galloway, the left, oh, look at this, all this great. Yeah, he was good on Palestine. On almost every other question, the Workers' Party, environmentalism is anti-working class. I mean, it's just terrible, the kind of reactionary stuff that he peddles, nationalist crap. And this idea that George Galloway is some kind of hero of the British working class, it just, I'll put it in the link. You can read the 3 articles in the Left Lane. Second, I actually, at this stage in the class struggle, I don't think it makes much sense at all for candidates to run socialist, communists, etc. I just think that, I mean, look at what happened in the by-election in Birmingham. Dave Nellis, a credible person, you know, a good speaker, House of former MP, etc. In a by-election where you can bring in people from all over the country, how many votes did he get? 300. These campaigns are demoralizing campaigns, running communists, running socialists. You know, it just does not advance things. We have so many defeats on the left that I don't think there's really much point of people at this stage of running for parliament, because it just, you know, a lot of it's about the voting system, which needs to change. That's a whole other story. Third point is, I know I've read my Lenin 50 years ago, etc. Let's look like what happened in the state of Michigan in the United States recently, where in the Democratic primary, over 100,000 people voted uncommitted because they were not going to support Trump, but they didn't want Biden to take their votes for granted. So it was a kind of spoil your ballot campaign. None of the above. We don't want this stuff. And I actually think in the conjuncture right now in the UK, that a spoil your ballot campaign would be quite effective, because we can, in fact, Labour, and it's partially again because of the voting system, takes left-wing votes for granted. That's the way the whole thing works. It's only 2 parties can ever win in this country, in Canada or the United States. And if we in fact said, you know, you can put different spins on spoil your ballot, none of the above, you can challenge the whole nature of these elections. You can say, do not take us for granted, blah, blah, blah. I think, in fact, that might, I mean, you know, and not hundreds on organizing this, but this idea that none of the above, not the Greens, not the Lib Dems, obviously not the Tories, but not Labour either, in fact, is what we want to change society. And I really like, you know, bring in a group led by Donkey, some real fun, make fun of Keir Starmer, all this kind of stuff. I think that might, in this moment, in fact, you know, if you got 200,000-300,000 spoil your ballots, and the ballots are counted, they're registered as spoiled, in fact, could ignite things. So thanks a lot, Tina.
Well, Alan, I mean, just on that, I mean, don't you think, you know, if you have, if it's like the American presidential elections, you know, Trump, Biden, I mean, I totally agree with you. That's spoiling the ballot is the only thing you could do. The Brexit referendum, actually, you know, a boycott, I think, would have been the right thing to do rather than choosing which butcher you support. But in a campaign where comrades in Manchester, for example, can explain this is what we actually think needs to happen. You know, we don't agree with Labour, we don't agree with the Tories, Greens are crap, and this is the kind of program that, you know, socialists need. I think that's quite a convincing argument.
I actually don't, because to organize a successful campaign in a constituency with, you know, 75,000 voters, etc., you have to have at least 100 people on the ground leafleting, have any kind of impact. And there's no independent candidates that I know of, maybe Corbyn, who could sort of mobilize that, but who could in fact have any, even to keep your deposit. Dave Nellis. I mean, what's this idea that people, he's a credible guy. I'm not a Trotskyist, but I mean, he's, it's a former, he's from the area, blah, 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 blah. These little isolated, Emma Code, this one in Liverpool, they do not build confidence. They just say, oh, fuck, we just got screwed again. People put all this effort. They should, in fact, I think, be doing three things. One, they should be campaigning for proportional representation, because that, in fact, would open the chance. I mean, Britain is the only country that does not have a serious left of social democratic party. All over Europe, all kinds of parties, not all necessarily good like the Linke, but it's a long story. But at least you got some kind of a chance of having a left party with proportional representation. So campaigning for that. Second, instead of wasting all this time, thousands of pounds running, why not, in fact, build up the mass movement? Because, in fact, it is the weakness of the mass movement, which is a big factor in why things are not moving forward. Whereas for example, in Scotland, when they formed the Socialist Party of Scotland, which got 6 members of parliament, we should never forget that, in the Scottish Parliament, that was because it came out of a wider struggle over the poll tax and also about Scottish independence. There was a real growing mass movement in Scotland, the Scottish Socialist Party, which had 3,000 members. Like, in England, by comparison, that would be 30,000 members. That's phenomenal. If you had a party of 30,000 members in England, you could do a hell of a lot of good work. But that party grew up. I mean, because we all know how Tommy Sheridan, that's a whole other story. But that you see, in like Michigan, they said, don't take us for granted. And they got 100,000 votes. And I think that kind of spirit can maybe attract some people, their involvement. It's not saying don't vote. It's saying going into the ballot box and say none of the above. It's a real protest vote.
Okay, thanks for coming on, Alan. That was interesting and certainly different to what our speakers have been saying. So what do you say? Is it a waste of time? No.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's similar to some of the points that people have raised in discussions that we've had with people. I guess for me, I suppose one important point to preface it with is that we're not expecting to get elected. We're not expecting to get a deposit back. That's not the kind of perspective that we're coming into it with. We're coming into it with the idea that we will use this opportunity to kind of openly put communist politics out there, to train ourselves in practice to do that, because it is an unfamiliar thing for people on the left. It is a challenging thing to do. It gives us the opportunity to think about how we communicate those, how we engage people. We have those conversations with people. We'll find out what works and what doesn't work in practice. It's the opportunity to work with other communists in the area, in groups or not in groups, to, when you kind of get that word out, you have an opportunity to work practically on that. And I suppose from my perspective, I appreciate what you're saying, that you think you feel it would be a demoralizing experience, but certainly for myself, I've found it the opposite so far. It's been a really positive experience. Nobody who's involved in the project is under any illusions about what we're going to achieve in terms of the vote. It's about what we'll achieve for ourselves in terms of that project, the connections we'll be able to make with people, the skills we'll be able to build ourselves in expressing communist politics, in developing and training ourselves in that, and that, every little bit of that process so far, from choosing the constituency that we're going to stand in, working on developing the manifesto, thinking about the way that it was all going to look. All of those have been political questions and political discussions that have been really important to us. In this kind of this project, I didn't know what it'd be like kind of when we set out with the idea to do it, but actually it's been appealing to people that that we're going to have this opportunity to openly present communist politics in a way that we don't always get to do. I appreciate things about, these different kind of, I don't know what they're called, led by donkeys, things like that. but to a degree, they still represent a kind of almost a defeatist position in society, where we always see ourselves as this kind of this protest movement where we're just protesting against this, that, and the other, and we're not getting the chance to articulate and advance our vision of the transformation of society. And that's what we're trying to focus on with this, and that's what we're trying to develop, even on this really small scale. So I appreciate what you're saying in terms of the experiences, especially for, you know, especially for a lot of these kind of left projects that will be emerging in this period, like Collective. People will come into this thinking that they're going to get elected, but that's not the position that we're coming from. That's not the approach that we're coming from, and what we're trying to achieve through this. You know, I feel positive about it, and I feel it will be, will hopefully be a positive experience because of that, because of, I suppose, what we're trying to achieve out of it. But I appreciate the comments, and it's certainly some of the discussions that we've been having locally. So thank you for that.
Of course, it would be better if there was a mass movement and, you know, a political party emerges, a national communist party, obviously, that we're all striving for. But I think, you know, in the meantime, yeah, it's one of the many things communists can do, isn't it? Well, one of the few things communists can do, actually. This is a forum, but standing in elections is certainly one of the tactics we can consider. Chris, did you want to say anything else, or do you think she's covered it all?
Well, Kat has basically answered everything. But I would just very quickly, in terms of William's comments, I mean, especially on like the lack of tradition, working class tradition in Britain and what have you. And I mean, it's, fair enough, but wrong. I mean, we live in Manchester, and there's a statue to Abraham Lincoln in Manchester, which you might think is a bit of an odd thing. But the reason we have a statue of Abraham Lincoln is because mill workers in Lancashire and around Manchester decided they would much rather be hungry, and their kids would be hungry, than they would mill cotton that came from the south during the Civil War. So there is that. There is numerous examples of the British working class, you know, furnishing their internationalist credentials. I think, you know, when we talk about the working class now, and we look at particularly amongst young workers and students and what have you, you know, the big questions that they are mobilized around are international questions. There's a good reason why hundreds of thousands are out on the streets in London week in, week out, up and down the country in different cities and towns and what have you. You know, because the working class in this country is, you know, is not bought off by imperialism, is not bought off by reforms or anything like that. The majority of the working class in Britain fully understands what is going on in the world, fully understands that the war in Ukraine, what is taking place in Gaza, like impacts on their daily lives, and it is wrong. And we see that in polls, we see that in demonstrations, you know, time and time again. So I think, you know, we don't need to go back in history to look at the radical tradition that we have one in Britain. But we certainly have a working class that is alive to what is going on in the world, and is you know, takes to the streets on that basis.
Absolutely. Chartists, or the first working class party in the world, is also, you know, if we're talking about tradition, there's a lot there. Sorry, William, we actually have to move on because Steve Freeman is waiting in the wings. Thank you very much, Kat. Thank you very much, Chris. I think it was a very interesting discussion. I wish you well, and I'm sure we're going to hear from you again. And if comrades want to have contact details, etc., we can certainly email them out when we follow up from this session. Steve Freeman now, please. We want to talk about the Communist Manifesto, and that has a lot to do with what we've just been talking about, because it is a form of program, and we have been talking about what kind of program communists, Marxists should stand on. So, Steve, it would be interesting to hear your take on the Communist Manifesto, the key issues, and why we're still banging on about it, as we put it in the title.
Yeah, thank you, Tina. Let me do a bit of screen sharing, because I've done a few PowerPoints for this, just to hopefully get us through, because I'm going to do that one, I think. That's the one I want. And sorry a minute, I'm going to share. Is that shared? Yeah, yep. That's shared. Yep. And if I hit that one, it should go out there somehow. There it goes.
There you go.
Communist Manifesto. I hope I can find oh yeah, I can do it this way, can't I? That will do it. No.
Yeah, good.
Hold a minute. That's the way to do it. Okay, there we go. You like that one better than the other green ones. But anyway.
Red.
Communist Manifesto. I was trying to get no, okay. There is a point in the Communist Manifesto where Marx says, we can sum it all up in one phrase. He says, it's in the second part. He says, the theory of the communists may be summed up in the single sentence, the abolition of property. That's what Marx brought to the party, as it were, in his development of his ideas. And what I'm going to do is, I'm going to, obviously I'm talking about the Communist Manifesto from, let's have a look, if we look at that a minute. Yeah, so these are the main points I'm going to try to cover. I'm going to talk about origins and method. I'm going to talk about the Red Republican, and that's a newspaper, not a party or anything like that. I'm going to talk about the relationship between republicanism and communism and Marx's journey, in order that we can then look at the manifesto and look at two aspects of the manifesto which need to be kind of separated: the national part of it, or the national question, and the world question. So I'm going to look at those two things, look at the detail, and then finally I'm going to compare the manifesto with the demands of the Communist Party in Germany. Okay, so those are the 7 points I want to go over. So let me begin then. Famously, the opening line of the Communist Manifesto says, "A spectre is haunting Europe, a spectre of communism." And it's worth just putting some dates into this. The Communist Manifesto, and I'll come back to that phrase in a minute, was drafted as a result of a decision of 1847 of the Second Congress of the Communist League, that Marx and Engels would draft a manifesto. And Marx worked on it in between, I think, November, December into January of 1848. And it was printed in 1848 in the German Workers' Educational Society's print shop in London. So that's when it was printed, just as it were, in time for, as it were, what was to be the 1848 revolutions, which of course began very shortly. Now, I think that the Communist Manifesto must be seen alongside another document which we don't tend to associate together, but it's the demands of the Communist Party in Germany. I will try to see how those two things go together, should be seen together. If you look at both of them side by side and compare them, you can see there are some things quite different between them and some things that are very much the same. The spectre that's haunting Europe, the spectre of communism, well, essentially, that was, of course, the threat to the ruling monarchies of Europe, the Tsar, the King of Prussia, the King of France, the Queen Victoria, the Emperor of Austria, and of course the Pope. And that threat came from the fear of the masses of the people. And what people really were interested in was democracy. The ruling elites feared and dreaded democracy. The Chartist movement in England, the reign of terror, everything that really was associated with the French Revolution. It was the French Revolution that was a spectre, really, that was haunting the ruling classes, not the Russian Revolution of 1917, obviously. But the ruling classes did not want to warn of the danger of democracy, so they invented a scare story about communism. I could imagine the Daily Mail of that time would have been carrying all the front pages about the threat of communism. But communism was equated in the public mind with anarchy, violent mobs, rioting, that we're going to steal all your property, your wealth, steal your wife, your children, and destroy all religion. So the horrors of communism or anarchy were propaganda that was being made against the democratic movement of the time. I mean, it served the same divisive role that the allegation of anti-Semitism, I think, served in the Labour Party in 2017. I mean, the actual examples of anti-Semites in the Labour Party were estimated to be, I think, if I have it right, 0.01% of Labour Party members. Okay, so it seemed to me there are more anti-Semites in the Labour Party in 2017 than there were communists in the whole of Europe in 1847. It wasn't a real threat, it was one that was conjured up by the ruling classes of Europe, the monarchies of Europe, actually, and the emperors of Europe. But in a way, Marx and Engels dissolved to put the record straight and to explain what communism really meant and to show that it was the logical outcome of capitalism and the unstoppable growth of the new working classes. So although the fear of communism was great, what people understood by that was small, and that's what they really essentially said. We're going to take the bull by the horns and tell everybody and explain to everybody what communism really is. So who is the spectre? Well, the spectre was the masses. The spectre was revolution. The spectre was the French Revolution that all the ruling classes feared. And anarchism was the thing they wanted to split the popular movement, frighten off the middle classes and all the rest of it. What about origins? Let's just talk a little bit about that. Let's say a little bit about origin and method. I thought I would talk about my own first encounter with the Communist Manifesto. First of all, when I first read the Communist Manifesto in 1968, it was. I went to college and I had to do a course in sociology, and I had no idea what that was, but there was no choice in it. And one of the books that we had to read was the Communist Manifesto. And for me, it was actually quite a transformative moment, because although there were parts of it were kind of double Dutch to me, I just didn't mean anything to me at all, there was a part of it that was really very powerful. And in that sense, it made complete sense to me. It made me think differently about how the world worked, and it spoke to me about life today. So I think there's a part of the Communist Manifesto that's still very powerful to this day. I think there are other bits of it that don't necessarily work. But I will identify that part later, but essentially to say that part, especially in the first section of the Communist Manifesto called the bourgeois and proletarians, the bourgeoisie, the bourgeois and proletariat, in that first section, I think is you can read it about it as a description of capitalism today, and it's very, very powerful. I wanted to critically, I mean, we're looking back from 2024 when we've got America, China, and the European Union. I mean, China was nothing in 1847. In fact, the Communist Manifesto was very, very European orientated. In the later things, they talk about Russia and they talk more about United States. But they're really talking about the world of 1848. I think what's quite interesting to read, people don't read them either, are the prefaces. These are the editions when Marx and Engels look back. They look back on the manifesto in 1872 in the German preface to the German edition, the Russian edition, another German edition, the English edition of 1888, right the way through the 1890, 1992, 1993. Now these moments of looking back are very important, because they show how capitalism has developed, and it allows Marx and Engels to criticize the Communist Manifesto, looking back at it. And of course, from 2024, we have to undertake the same. We have to undertake the same process. I'll come to one of those editions, the 1872 edition, what's said there in a minute or two. Next thing I wanted to talk about was the Red Republican. The Red Republican was a newspaper, and it was published by a chartist, a radical left-wing Democrat chartist called George Julian Harney, who lives not far from where I live in London, in southeast London. And in November 1850, he and his paper published the manifesto for the first time in England. And it was a translation done by Helen Macfarlane, a Scottish chartist and feminist. And there were two, in this paper, there were two documents side by side in this issue of, first of all, there was the Communist Manifesto itself. And then there was another document called Republican Principles. And this was a document produced by William James Linton, calling on the working class in England to fight for an English republic. And there's an interesting, if you study working class politics in the later 19th century, the relationship between Marx and Linton is something that one can actually look at. But it says that there's two things going on all the time in this, and that's what I want to elaborate on. So I'm going to go ahead to a little bit further and to say that I'm taking it from the perspective of Republican communism and the Communist Manifesto. So what's the term Republican communism? Well, Republican communism for me means the Republican road to communism. So we need to see that there's a very important interplay, and we'll see that in a minute, going on between Republican ideas and communist ideas. And interesting enough, the Republican word doesn't appear in the Communist Manifesto at all. But if you take the idea of Republican communism, then you can see the Republican element is in something called the minimum program, and the communist element is in something called the maximum program. So you can see the idea of Republican communism as a minimum and maximum program. And if you start to compare the demands of the Communist Party in Germany, 1848, and the Communist Manifesto, you can begin to see the contrast between these two ideas, which are there. This is the program, the leaflet that they intervened in the German Revolution of 1848. So we need then to just have a quick look at this idea a little bit further. It's important to say that Marx began his political development as a Republican. He wasn't a communist early on, because the important thing, of course, was the French Revolution that shaped everybody's thinking in the early 19th century. And of course, it gave rise to Hegel's history and philosophy and dialectic of human history. But in politics, Hegel was a supporter of constitutional monarchy, no doubt influenced by the British monarchy. The young Hegelians, the radical students of Hegel, including Bruno Bauer and Feuerbach and Moses Hess and Karl Marx, of course, took up Republican ideas against Hegel. And the core of these ideas were about human freedom. Becoming a free person requires a free state in which sovereignty rests with the people and political power is constrained by constitution and the rule of law. Now, Marx began to develop, and we're talking about 1843, a Republican critique of republicanism, recognizing that republicanism wouldn't bring true freedom. Political freedom did not mean economic freedom, as Marx began to consider the question of private property that I mentioned before as being a fundamental barrier to freedom, and hence the problem of wage slavery. So Marx then, as Marx was developing, he began to recognize the powerful forces being released by the new rising capitalism, and began to turn to the alternative of communism. Marx's transition from republicanism to communism takes place around about 1843, 1844. The big shift takes place when Marx goes to Paris, where he becomes where he's influenced by French workers and communists in Paris. He comments in 1834 about the Rylance uprising, the insurrection by the working class in Lyons. And he says that Lyons workers believed they were pursuing only political aims, that they were soldiers of the Republic, whereas actually they were soldiers of socialism. So here he's beginning to see this transition. So Bruno Leopold, in his book on Citizen Marx, says Marx's transition from communism was thus not an abandonment of republicanism, as it extended key republican principles into both the political and economic realm.
Just to know that you've spoken for 15 minutes.
Right, okay, well, I will move on very quickly. It'll all fall into place in a minute, Tina, I hope so. Thank you. But of course, all this changed very rapidly in 1871 when the Paris Commune took place, and Marx recognized that the working class of Paris established a form of democratic republic, which enabled them to take control of Paris. So Marx's journey, and then we'll come back to the dialectic of Marx's politics, therefore, is this, I would say. Thesis, Republican, up to 1843-44. Antithesis, communism, 1843 onwards. Synthesis, Republican communism after the Paris Commune. So he was a Republican and not a communist. Then he became a communist with Republican values. And then eventually they re-emerged again in the 1870s. Now, you might say, well, what's this got to do with the Communist Manifesto then? Well, the fact is that if we want to locate Marx in this story, we have to locate where his ideas were in 1847, 1848, and not where they would become. And so you can... we can now turn, I think, to the Communist Manifesto. Oh no, we can now turn to the Communist Manifesto itself. Okay, the Communist Manifesto has these sections. Obviously, I can't read through all these sections. I hope you do get a chance to look at it. I think the most important one, really, the one that really does stand out, is this first section, bourgeois and proletarians. But proletarians and communists, including the 10-point plan at the end of it, are also very significant. I'm not going to cover the third part, which is looking at all the socialist and communist literature, but I will come back to this at the end. I want to go then to the preface of the 1872 edition to see the point I made before. 1872, after the Paris Commune. And in 1872, Marx says, in the preface to this edition of the Communist Manifesto, in view of the practical experience gained in the first February Revolution 1848, because of course the manifesto was written before the 1848 revolution, and then still more in the Paris Commune, where the proletariat for the first time held political power for 2 whole months, the program has in some details been antiquated. So Marx is himself looking back with a later experience on the Communist Manifesto to see really what is the problem with it. And he's bringing into this the lessons of the People's Republic of Paris, the People's Commune, the Commune of Paris of 1871. So I now want to highlight, if I could, Tina, 2 issues. I think we have to look at the Communist Manifesto through the lens of both national and international and of the world. And I suppose I would just take the national question to mean what to do about the nation and what to do about the world. That's what our programme has to address. I don't mean the national question in the very narrow sense of referring to Palestine, Kurdistan, Catalonia, Scotland, Ireland, whatever. I don't mean it in that sense. I mean that we've all got a national question about what is the future, where we are. So I want to draw out, first of all, the national aspects of the Communist Manifesto. And it's important to notice in order to understand how they link with the international dimension of it. First of all of these countries are mentioned on the very last page of the Communist Manifesto. So although I would argue it's very much about internationalism, these different countries are mentioned in the Communist Manifesto. On the last page, they're talking about Germany. And at the very end of the Communist, say Germany is taken over as a revolutionary leader in Europe from England and France. So we have this idea of unevenness. And the Communist Manifesto says the following: communists, it says, are further reproached with desiring to abolish countries and nationality. It says the working men have no country. We cannot take from them what they have not got. But since the proletariat must first acquire political supremacy, must rise to be the leading class of the nation, must constitute itself the nation, insofar it is so far itself national, though not in the bourgeois sense. So there's an emphasis here that we have to take the nation, the question of the nation. That doesn't contradict the idea that the working class has no nation. It says later, communists are distinguished from other working class parties by only this, that in the national struggles of the distinguished from other working class parties, let's move this over here, other working class parties, one, in the national struggles of the proletarians of different countries, they point out and bring to the front the common interests of the entire proletariat, independent of all nationality. Again, national struggles, he references. Another one says here, we have seen above that the first step in the revolution by the working class is to raise the proletariat to the position of the ruling class to win the battle of democracy. And then the third one of these is, though it says here, that though not in substance, yet in form, the struggle of the proletariat with the bourgeoisie is at first a national struggle, that the proletariat of each country must first of all settle matters with its own bourgeoisie. Now, the reason I'm emphasizing all this is to say that there is a national dimension to the struggle for communism, and that doesn't contradict the international dimension. How are we doing, Tina? How much have I got? More longer have I got?
About 5 minutes.
5 minutes. Oh, that's okay. I'm
7
going to get
minutes.
here then. 7 minutes. That'll be even better. Okay, the world question. If I wanted to really talk about the world question, I suppose, I think the classic is the opening of the first section of the Communist Manifesto that says this. Let's just put that down a minute. The history of all, this is a famous quote, the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Freeman, slave, patrician, plebeian, lord and serf, guild master and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight, a fight that each time ended either in the revolutionary reconstitution of society at large or in the common ruin of the contending classes. Okay, so I think that this section becomes really a discussion about the question of capitalism itself. I mean, this is a section 1, where they describe hold on a second. Where they describe capitalism, that capitalist, it says that capitalism essentially appears as, first of all, capitalism appears as a revolutionary force. The manifesto says that first the bourgeoisie in its scarce 100 years, has created more massive and more colossal productive forces than all preceding generations together. The constant revolutionizing of production, the uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, everlasting uncertainty and agitation distinguishes the bourgeois epoch from all other epochs. So he goes on to really argue through this, how the application of science and technology, steam navigation, railways, electric telegraphs, etc., clearing of whole continents, and goes on to say that capital knows no boundaries. It spreads across the world in search of a constantly expanding markets for its products. It chases profit and wage labour across the surface of the globe. Capital must nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, establish connections everywhere. Capital shapes the world market and subordinates labour to its will. And it polarizes, it creates its opposite, the working class, because capital is in effect the other side of the working class. Wherever capital goes, the working class is created. And then he goes on to talk about how the system is crisis ridden, how it leads to constant, the manifesto says that capital has conjured up a giant means of production exchange, is like a sorcerer who is no longer able to control the powers of the netherworld that he has called up by his cells. And this is paving the way for more extensive and destructive crises. And then he ends up by discussing the fact that in creating the working class as the universal class, the universal world class across the world, the international class of the proletariat, that then we're creating the grave digger of capitalism. And so this first section is, I mean, I can't do it justice. I think it's, if everybody hasn't read it, and I'm sure most of you have, but it is really, I think, a really excellent description of capitalism, written in 1848, and it still remains true to this day, the way in which capitalism operates. So I think that is a really important section. Now I want to move on towards the end now. I'm going to jump the next section, except I'm going to come to the end really by looking at what did they come at the end of the Communist Manifesto. These are the 10 points at the end of the second section of the Communist Manifesto. It says, in most advanced countries, the following will be pretty generally applicable. The abolition of property in land and application of all rents of land, heavy progressive and graduated income tax, abolition of all rights of inheritance, confiscation of the property of all immigrants and rebels, centralisation of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly, going on to say centralisation of the means of communication and transport in the hands of the state, extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state. Moving on, equal liability of all work, establishment of industrial armies, combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries, gradual abolition of the distinction between town and country. And then the last point, free education for all children in public schools, abolition of children's factory labour in its present form, etc. That is the 10 points at the end of the Communist Manifesto. They brought that round to that particular point. So I said, and I'll end on this point, Trina, I want to compare that with the other, what I've called the companion document, the one that goes alongside it and has to be seen in relation to it. And this is where you've got this national dimension that I mentioned before, that I said is very, very important part of the Communist Manifesto. And it starts with this, the demands of the Communist Party in Germany. It starts, proletarians of all countries unite. And then it says, the whole of Germany shall be declared a united, indivisible republic. Every German who is 21 years old shall be a voter and eligible for election, assuming he has not been sentenced for a criminal offence. Representatives of the people shall be paid so that workers... Now, that was a demand of the Chartists, if you remember, because, of course, only rich people could afford to sit in Parliament. The universal arming of the people. In future, armies shall at the same time be workers' armies, so that our armed forces will not consume as in the past, but produce even more. So there'll be working armies. In addition, these shall be the means of organising work. Maintenance of justice shall be a free. Imagine if we had a national justice service that you could go to court free. So the points 1 to 5 are the Republican programme that I was mentioning at the very beginning. Yeah, when they've come to apply it to Germany, they've come to apply the manifesto to Germany. They've got that now 6 and 7 and 8. These are all to do with feudalism, feudal estates, peasants. So I'm going to skip over that. All these measures are about that. So in Germany, there's a peasantry. So in addressing the situation in Germany, they're addressing the conditions of the peasantry. Okay, that's not something that would appear in the maximum, if you like, Communist Manifesto, because it's not talking about any country in particular. But when you try to apply it to a country like Germany, where you have a peasantry, then you've got to make some adaptations to the actual real situation on the ground. And then they go on to looking at these private banks replaced. You can see these, by the way, 10, 11, 12. These look straight out of the original Communist Manifesto. State bank, means of transport, railways, all these things will be in the hands of the state. Remuneration of civil servants, complete separation of church from the state. Again, that's a national demand, clergy, etc. Limitations of inheritance, strongly progressive. So you can see some national workshops. That was really, I guess, was what they demanded in France, the French Republican. State shall guarantee the livelihood of all workers. Universal free education of the people. Again, that was in the Communist Manifesto. So what I'm saying, Tina, as I'll finish on this point, I'll just go out of this screen sharing bit, stop it here. What I really want to say is, oh, it hasn't done that. Why has it not done that?
No,
okay.
It's good.
Is it? Okay. Yep. Some bit I'm missing. I can't show why. I can't seem to have got. Okay.
I can see you.
You can see me, but I can't see you. That's the problem.
All right. Okay. Don't worry about it. We're here.
Okay. Yeah, that looks better.
Okay. You're done? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm more or less done. What I'm going to say, just to summarise that. So we're looking at the Communist Manifesto from 2024. Marx and Engels were looking at it from 1870, 1880, 1890. It was a huge step forward in its time. Its description of capitalism is absolutely fantastic and stands up to today. The idea of a minimum and maximum programme, if you take that with the Communist Party of Germany and the Communist Manifesto side by side, you can see the development of both republicanism and communism going along side by side. That's relevant today, I would argue. Republicanism still has a role in the world today, as does communism. That's where we should be today. I think we have to learn from that. Of course, we're living in a very different world today, but there's a lot to learn from the manifesto. Very well worth the read, including the prefaces and their Marx and Engels' own criticisms of that. Okay,
right. Thank you very much, comrade. It's 8:45, so we don't have an awful lot of time to discuss. But if you have comments or questions, please click raise hand. And I mean, just to echo Steve, the Communist Manifesto is a very readable, one of the greatest pieces of literature ever, and it is really well worth reading, including all the prefaces, because I mean there's one there where Engels basically sums up the Communist Manifesto in 3 big points, and that is worthwhile just from that, explaining how the Communist Manifesto explains how capitalism comes into being. And that brings me to a question of Carol, which I think is an interesting question. It explains how capitalism comes into being as a revolutionary, in a revolutionary manner. It's the forces of production against the means of production. They are they become fetters and have to be done away with, and explains that capitalism and also it develops the working class, and the working class becomes the gravedigger of capitalism. Does that mean that, in that sense, capitalism is described as inevitable, that it always had to happen, it always had to come, that capitalism develops out of feudalism, which you actually get quite a lot. You get the sort of the transition, you get you know, you have to go Middle Ages, feudalism, capitalism, socialism, communism. Is that inevitable? Was that inevitable at the time, or could have other things develop, which I think actually is the case. Other things could have developed, but capitalism did develop, and with it developed the working class. How do you?
I agree with you, Tina. I don't like to do inevitable things in history. I'm not sure. I just think that when capital began to develop, it was superior to everything else. Therefore, it was more dynamic, and therefore it just kind of overcame everything else. You know, and it grew, and the more it grew, the more powerful it got, and the more it spread. Because it's a means of exploiting labor by increasing their productivity. I don't think that happened in feudal times. The thing about capitalism was, although it made profits by having slaves, African slaves in the West Indies and all that sort of thing, made a huge amount out of the labor of slaves. Its system of production, when it got going, the factory system, meant that it could exploit labor on a huge scale, and it's continued to do that as we've now reached automation and all the rest of it. So they've continued to shed labor and expand, and shed more labor and expand, so that the productivity goes up and up, and everything is swamped out with it. We can't hold again. You know, it overcomes everything until it goes to the point of crashing, which it does periodically. Because Marx, this is another story, but Marx showed how in the way the value works, every now and again, there will be massive disruptions in the way the system works. And then there's a whole burning of billions of pounds, as we saw in 2008. There's
also an interesting, I mean, Marx and Engels made especially Engels, who brought out various editions, later editions of the manifesto after Karl Marx died. He tweaks various things, but in general, they wanted to leave it as it is, as a historical document. Yeah, where right. He did make a tweak, though, and I'm just going to share that quickly because that is an interesting one, is almost the first sentence, the history of all hitherto existing society as the history of class struggles, which sounds, totally right. But then actually he had to clarify its written history, and that's a long footnote there, where he does explain how, into the 18th, 19th century, which he then expands on in his book on, what's it called now? God, Jesus, what's the book called? Where he talks about, Urkommunismus, explaining that there are all sorts of, the origin of the family, private property, and the state. Yeah. Where he's explaining that there are village communities everywhere, which hold everything in common, and the communistic societies. So he does explain that even during the beginnings of capitalism, there were other forms of living together that were not feudal. Actually, there were alternatives to feudalism, and people were living in a different way, which means feudalism didn't spread globally quite as capitalism did. So other possibilities would have been possible. But of course, with the rise of capitalism, it does create the gravedigger of capitalism. And I think that section, as you say, is the most interesting and the most moving one. I would like to talk to you briefly about one section, though, which has which I keep mentioning whenever I talk about the Communist Manifesto, because I think it's a really important one. Is this chapter 2, I believe it's the
proletarians and communists.
Exactly, which has been used by many people as explaining why we can't possibly build a communist party, a Marxist party. And this is this formulation. Oh, can you see what I'm saying?
I think it's the communists do not form a separate party opposed to other working class parties. Yeah. It's probably that, Tina.
Yeah, sorry, I can't see my...
They have no interest separate and apart from those of the proletariat as a whole. Yeah. They do not set up any sectarian principles of their own by which to shape and to mold the proletarian movement.
And that has been used and has been explained to me by many a laborite in particular, that means we can't possibly form, get involved in communist policies. We have to basically support the Labour Party to the end of time. Here it is. And a really fascinating explanation, or a really fascinating treaty, is Hal Draper on the travels of the Communist Manifesto. And he actually has retranslated bits of it and explains that this section, this famous section, the communists do not form a separate party opposed to other working class parties. Actually, it's been translated a bit wrong. And the way to translate it and make sense of it is the communists are not a special party vis-a-vis the other working class parties. They have no interest separate from the interests of the whole proletariat. But of course, the whole Communist Manifesto, which is also called the program of the the manifesto of the Communist Party, is of course about building a communist party, forming a communist party. The whole tenor of the whole program, the whole book is about that communists do have get together, and they do not disdain to share their views, and they always come out as communists, and they're in alliances with other parties, with social democratic parties, where and when needed. But they do formulate their program, and they do formulate, and they get together in a communist party. I think that is a really important lesson and really important meaning of the Communist Manifesto. It's one of the most read books on the planet, but it is so misunderstood in large sections. People using it to say, "Do not form a communist party," when exactly it says the opposite. Is something we should stress over and over again, I think. And coming to the question of, sorry, you want to say something?
I was going to say something. Yeah, I agree. Both those things can be true. I think at the time with the Chartist movement, I think Marx and Engels were very involved in the Chartist movement. They didn't want to set up their party in opposition to the Chartists. They supported the Chartist movement. But on the other hand, it's probably a question of, at what point are you part of the Chartist movement, and at what moment do you go off and set up a separate party from the Chartist party, and if you do that at the wrong time, it becomes sectarian. I think that was the argument, because even in the RSDLP, the Bolshevik faction stayed within the RSDLP until later, to a certain point, when they went off to form a communist party. So they didn't. It's not automatic. We should go off and start with a separate party. I think that's that. But I think it's more tactical, Tina, than principled, is what I would say. Timing and things like that.
Absolutely. And of course, the Chartists, by the time Engels put some of these prefaces out, the Chartists didn't exist anymore. So he was quite aware that they weren't an eternal party. Yeah. But yes, the key is that that communists fight as communists, and we do not pretend to be social democrats. We do not pretend to be reforming.
You can see that in the First International. When they formed the First International, they had a broad range of different, parties and groups in there, and they were clearly within that, and they were campaigning for their own communist politics within that. They were fighting for that, but they didn't. I think it means they weren't doing it in a sectarian way to split the party. They weren't aimed at splitting up the First International. They wanted it to succeed up to a certain point, anyway.
Yeah, indeed. And so to come back to that question, which is quite an important one, is the question of minimum maximum program, which is of course also quite disputed on the left. Generally, you have the Trotskyist left, which says that's a lot of rubbish, that leads to Stalinism automatically. It leads to the failures of the Second International, the folding of the Second International. But I mean, why do you think communists, and according to the Communist Manifesto, why is that a program that makes sense still to today? And can you explain it a bit more, how it's different?
Well, I think in a way, I mean, this is my take on it. My take on it is that there needs to be a world program, because capitalism is a world system, the working class is a world. So in a way, the maximum program should be a world program. And if you look at the Communist Manifesto, you could think that's a kind of world program, but not necessarily. So I think that could, as a maximum program, maybe it's not as best as it could be, but it's clearly stating something. But the minimum program is how the working class can get to power in one country. That's what I said was what they said was the national dimension. And they put all the markers down that the working class had to lead the battle for democracy. It had to become the leading force in the nation. It had to reconstitute the nation in a proletarian sense. You know, you could say England is a proletarian nation. The vast majority of people are proletarians, but the proletariat aren't in charge of anything. It's not a proletarian nation politically in any other sense, is it? You know, so the working class hasn't won, obviously. So I think that you have to have a clear. But the thing is, the two of them have to link together. They're not separate. I mean, the stagist idea is that the Republican program and the maximum program have got no connection. They're different, but really one should lead into the other. If the working class were to come to power in a Paris Commune, in some kind of republic, they wouldn't get anywhere without spreading that revolution internationally, which is where the maximum program, to be able to appeal to the workers of the world. You know, so
in other words, the minimum program is for the here and now, isn't it?
It's not a reformist program, right? It's a reform program. Now that's a subtle difference. A reformist program is a program that offers to work under our constitutional monarchy and our legal system and our house account, all the rest of it, within our whole constitution. Whereas the minimum program says, no, we need to change the fundamental way in which our democracy works. And that makes it a reform which has revolutionary implications. And it's not a republic is only a reform. I mean, most of the places in the world have got republics. But if there was a mass movement for a republic, that would have revolutionary implications for this country and where this country is. It would open up a whole new way of thinking about how the world works. So in a sense, it's not an ultra-left program. It's one that actually addresses the concerns of people, working class people, as they are now in the here and now. But it leads towards the development of revolutionary consciousness, I would argue, and hence towards
it deals with issues that go beyond the trade union struggle, or that go beyond the economic struggle, isn't it? I mean, the funny thing about the minimum maximum program is it is a transitional program, actually. Yes. You know, it is fluid and it transitions towards communism. And you could argue, I mean, in opposition to what is traditionally known as the transitional program of Trotsky, written in the 30s, when he expected capitalism to collapse with, you know, just pushing a bit for economic demands. I mean, it was probably wrong then, but it is definitely not going to work today. I think that is the difference, and perhaps one day we can have a discussion about that actually with somebody who believes in the value of the transitional program. But the minimum maximum program is transitional, but it takes high politics seriously. It says we have to win that battle for democracy. We don't just leave the House of Lords, the monarchy, all those questions,
and the House of Commons
class. You know, we have to democratize those things for the working class to take over. Sorry,
I would say one other point, that the reason that we can do that is because of all the classes in our society, only the working class is a democratic class. And what I mean by that is that the working class can only become a class for itself if it organizes itself democratically, either in its trade unions, shop stewards committees, and democratically in that society. So there's no other class that has that. The bourgeoisie doesn't need democracy. The petty bourgeois doesn't need democracy. The managerial class doesn't need it. The working class can only become, other than atomized workers, can become collective workers through democracy. So that program, the minimum program, is rooted in the very nature of the working class. That's why it works. It's not a reformist program in that sense.
And the maximum part obviously explains what communism is, where we're going to. I'm so sorry, Ian. I brought you in as a panelist and then I totally forgot about you and kept jabbering away with Steve. So please, Ian.
Just a couple of tiny little points. All I wanted to say was how a reading of the Communist Manifesto, or give it its proper title, the Manifesto of the Communist Party, given that there was no actual party called that in those days, the party in that sense meant, as it were, the proletariat for its own liberation. But the other point that I wanted to make was just how important that distinction is with regard to what the previous speakers were talking about. It's important to put forward Marxist ideas, not just another reformist idea, not the Labour Party 2.0, but a bit left-wing, Jeremy Corbyn, but a bit more with a bit more oomph or whatever. There is something very profoundly distinct about the communist project, and it is the complete transformation of society, not just who owns what or who controls what, or whether it's the state that runs it or whatever, but it's the transformation of a society that will become truly human for the first time in history. And the importance of this is particularly when people are talking about George Galloway. I can quite understand why people would vote for George Galloway in the context of Rochdale here and now, when the only issue at hand really was Gaza and the grotesque murder of 40,000 people in Gaza. But to describe, for example, the Workers' Party as being a communist party, you can see how there is no relationship whatsoever between the manifesto of the Communist Party put forward by Marx and Engels and what George Galloway stands for. He stands as a Stalinist, really, as a nationalist, and he talks in terms of questions around immigration, playing upon a nationalist concerns with competition for scarce jobs and housing and that kind of thing. And it's important, therefore, to make that distinction between us as communists, people who are in favor of the transformation, the end of the wages system, the end of human exploitation in all its forms, and the transition to a society which is direct participative democracy and the end of all social classes. And of course, capitalism is an important step along the way. It creates the conditions of abundance which make the socialism possible. Of course, it didn't have to go that way, and of course there was a lengthy correspondence between Vera Zulic, for example, who was a former Narodnik, of a more anarchist inclination, and Marx, about how in principle the Obshchina in Russia could form the basis of a transition which didn't have to go through capitalism. But that was under certain circumstances. Marx agreed it was possible, but under certain circumstances, and those circumstances would be fully, those countries that were fully developed capitalist societies having the transition to socialism. Yes, Russia could have skipped through that, but only if there was revolution, for example, in Germany, Britain, France, so on. It's really that distinction, I think, that has to be drawn out between we as communists and social democrats of one sort or another, reformists. I think the problem with putting forward a broad left kind of program is that it always ends up being the lowest common denominator. It always ends up being that the right is always prepared to split. The right is always prepared to split over whether it's Trident or whether it's the monarchy or some other aspect or whatever. What we have to stand on is our principles. Yes, we can work in a principled way with left social democrats or all sorts of other decent comrades. But there are certain things which we have to stand on, and that is, for example, the abolition, ultimately, of the state. Not as a programmatic demand. The end of the state would come about only with a fully developed socialist society. The state would wither away, as it were. So, of course, we would want to see a people's militia rather than a standing army to tyrannize over us. Of course, we would want to see ultimately the end of wage labor, the end of exploitation, and the end of money. We would be moving towards a fully human society where all relations take place on a human basis and rather than a contractual form. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ian. Anything to sum up, Steve?
No. Well, I think I'm okay with that. I think that the things that need to be thought about, and this actually applies to those comrades that were speaking earlier, want to stand in the elections in Manchester. What sort of program are they going to stand on? And what is the minimum program? That's what the guide to them is. I mean, a reformist program is basically one that works within the given constitution of the Crown in Parliament, the constitutional monarchy, the two-party system, all that other stuff, and doesn't mention it, and simply says we want more money for the health service, fairer taxes, and all the rest of it, and more nationalisation. That's a reformist program because it simply accepts the existing political and constitutional order as a given. So if the comrades in Manchester want to not do that, they've got to think outside that box. They've got to think about democracy, why this, what's wrong. I mean, I'll just make this point. The left think that yes, the monarchy is rubbish, we should get rid of that. The House of Lords is rubbish, perhaps we should abolish that. But nobody's come to think, you know what? The House of Commons is absolutely terrible, useless, and dangerous as an institution. Now, should we abolish that? And do we mean that we want to abolish Parliament now? I think that would be a wrong idea. So how do we abolish the House of Commons then? That's something that we have to talk about. I mean, when you see how as we had a meeting the other night, so I think we've got to start talking about how Parliament works, not just the House of Lords and the monarchy, much more about the democracy, its failing, and why that is not in the interests of the working class in this country or indeed internationally. And I think just one other point, Tina, I think that we've got to think of our communism very much more internationally and globally as well. We're not talking about national communism. Should be talking about socialism in one country. I think we should have learnt that from the Russian Revolution. But the working class can come to power in one country. It's just that if it does, it's screwed if it doesn't spread the revolution. You know, that's why we need a maximum program for international things.
Thank you very much, Steve. The comrades in Manchester might also take inspiration from that point about arming the people. That always goes down well in this in the current level of society.
Well, I mean, can I just make this point? It's how you put it over. I mean, we're quite a conservative country, so you can talk revolution like, well, it'll be blood and we'll kill everybody and all that sort of. You can use very rhetoric, and that will just piss everybody off. You've got to find a way of addressing a fairly conservative working class and making those points programmatically in a way that sounds like, you know what, that sounds like a bloody good idea. Why don't we do it?
It'd be quite easy to say that the police shouldn't be the ones having the only arms and running everything. It should be us policing our own working class communities. And then you quickly start thinking about, well, you know, what if the others are armed? And we probably might have to have some arms ourselves to learn how to use them as well. Thank you very much, Steve. Thanks very much, Ian and other comrades for participating, and Chris and Kat, of course. That was a very interesting discussion all the way through the session. Very good session. And we'll see you next week, hopefully, for the ABC of Marxism, again with Ian Spencer. Good night, comrades.